In Fallout 4, the damage number on your weapon isn't as reliable as it looks. The same weapon can melt one enemy and barely affect the next. Enemies that should go down quickly can suddenly feel like bullet sponges. And when you increase the difficulty, it gets even worse. Most players assume enemies are just getting stronger, but that's not what's really happening. Fallout 4 isn't just making enemies stronger, it's also making you weaker. Difficulty changes how your damage scales, resistance reshapes how your weapons perform, and targeting determines how efficiently that damage is applied. And the game never clearly shows how these systems interact, so combat often feels inconsistent even though it follows strict internal logic. Once you start to notice that inconsistency, a more important question appears. If difficulty isn't the full explanation, what actually determines how your damage works? The issue isn't your weapon, it's how the game calculates damage. To see why, we first need to understand how difficulty really changes combat. When most players increase the difficulty in Fallout 4, they expect enemies to become more dangerous in traditional ways. More intelligent enemies, more complex combat behavior. But that's not what actually changes. In Fallout 4, difficulty mainly changes how damage is calculated. Instead of improving enemy intelligence, the game adjusts how effective your attacks are and how punishing enemy attacks become. This means the same weapon, the same build, and the same encounter can feel completely different on higher difficulty. Not because the enemy suddenly became more skilled, but because every shot you fire is working against less favorable math. Your damage becomes less effective, enemy damage becomes more punishing. Fights last longer, mistakes become more costly, combat starts to feel slower and less predictable. Higher difficulty often feels unfair before it feels challenging. The game hasn't changed its rules, your margin for error has. But even after understanding this, something still doesn't fully add up. Because on the same difficulty, some enemies still feel easy, while others suddenly feel much harder to bring down. Which means difficulty scaling isn't the only system shaping your damage. To understand what else is happening, we need to look at the next hidden layer of Fallout 4's combat system. Even after understanding difficulty scaling, combat can still feel inconsistent. Because sometimes enemies don't just feel stronger, they feel unfair. You unload shot after shot into an enemy that should go down quickly. The weapon feels powerful, the damage numbers look high. And yet their health bar barely moves. This is the moment many players start questioning their build, their weapon choice, or even the difficulty setting. But the real cause is usually much simpler and much more hidden. In Fallout 4, the damage number on your weapon is not the damage an enemy actually takes. Every enemy has resistance values that reduce incoming damage before it affects their health. So a weapon that deals 100 damage might effectively hit for something closer to 60, or even less. But the real impact of resistance isn't just mathematical, it's experiential. Resistance changes how combat feels. A fight that should feel decisive suddenly feels slow. A weapon that should feel powerful suddenly feels weak. This is where the idea of bullet sponges is born. Imagine entering a fight with a powerful, slow-firing rifle. Each shot sounds devastating. Each impact feels heavy. But against a resistant enemy, nothing seems to happen. So you switch to a faster weapon with lower damage per shot. And suddenly the same enemy starts falling much more quickly. Nothing about the enemy changed, nothing about the difficulty changed, only your interaction with the resistance system changed. The fight didn't become easier, you become more aligned with the system. This is one of the biggest reasons Fallout 4 combat can feel inconsistent. But even once you start choosing weapons more carefully, some encounters still feel inefficient. Which raises another question. If resistance isn't the final explanation, what else determines how effective your damage really is? That's where targeting becomes critical. It isn't just about the math behind difficulty and damage resistance, it's also about you, the player, and where you aim. Not all enemies are vulnerable in the same way. Against human enemies, headshots are usually the fastest way to end a fight. They deal significantly more damage in short encounters. But the logic doesn't apply to every enemy. Robots often follow the opposite rule. Their heads can be heavily armored, which means aiming at the torso can be more effective than targeting what looks like the obvious weak point. Fallout 4 often punishes realistic instincts. What feels logical to aim at is not always what the game rewards. This is one of the main reasons combat feels inconsistent. Some enemies take this even further. Power armor enemies and sentry bots both have fusion cores that act as critical weak points. In these fights, one correct shot can replace an entire magazine. Targeting the fusion core can drastically shorten fights that would otherwise feel slow or resource intensive. What appears to be random durability is often just a targeting problem. Once you understand enemy structure, combat becomes less reactive and more about applying pressure at the right point. But even with correct targeting, some players still struggle, which suggests that knowing individual mechanics isn't enough. Real efficiency comes from combining these systems in practice. Once you understand how Fallout 4 actually calculates damage, combat stops feeling like something you endure and starts feeling like something you control. Fights that once felt slow or frustrating begin to change. Not because your gear suddenly improves, but because your decisions became more precise. This is where many players discover that combat effectiveness isn't just about having stronger weapons. It's about using the right tools in the right situations. Some playstyles naturally take greater advantage of the game's damage system. Sneak attack can massively increase your effectiveness, because multiplayers stack together. Well-placed stealth shot can end encounters before they properly begin. This is why stealth-focused builds often feel disproportionately powerful, especially on higher difficulty. But even outside of stealth, the biggest improvement often comes from changing how you choose weapons. Instead of asking, which weapon has the highest damage, the better question becomes, which weapon performs best in this encounter? Weapon choice becomes intentional instead of habitual. Enemy encounters become more readable. Difficulty stops feeling like an arbitrary punishment. Higher difficulty doesn't necessarily mean slower or more exhausting combat. It means the game rewards efficient decision-making more aggressively. Once you combine difficulty awareness, resistance understanding, and targeting strategy, enemies stop feeling like bullet sponges and start feeling like problems you can solve. At that point, combat shifts from reaction to planning. Because all of these mechanics are connected by one deeper rule. The game isn't testing your aim, it's testing how well you adapt to its systems. Once you see the full system, combat stops being a reaction and becomes a calculation. It's because several hidden systems are shaping every fight at the same time. Difficulty changes how effective your damage actually is, enemy resistances changes how your weapon performs in practice, and targeting determines how efficiently that damage is applied. Individually, these mechanics can feel confusing, but together they follow a consistent internal logic. Fallout 4's combat isn't primarily about raw weapon strength. It's about how well your decisions align with the game's underlying rules. Once you begin to see those rules, encounters stop feeling chaotic, enemies that once felt tanky start to make sense, and higher difficulty becomes less about punishment and more about understanding a different set of expectations. In that sense, Fallout 4 isn't just testing your gear or your aim, it's testing how well you understand the systems that define its combat. And once you understand those systems, you gain far more control over fights than the game initially suggests. Because the real difference between struggling in combat and mastering it is not your weapon. It's your mental model of how the game works. Understanding systems like this can completely change how Fallout 4 feels to play. There are still many mechanics the game never properly explains, and exploring those is something I want to continue doing on this channel. If this video helped you, leaving a like is a simple way to support my channel. And if you want to see more explanations like this in the future, subscribing helps a lot. Stay irradiated, and I'll see you in the next video.